turns the wealthiest country in Latin America into a humanitarian catastrophe? How do you obliterate in just 50 years what took a century to construct? Caracas 1970, the Saudi Venezuela. Glass skyscrapers piercing the sky, gleaming Cadillacs rolling off dealership lots, a currency worth more than the American dollar. Caracas 2024, crumbling high-rises, perpetual darkness from power failures, millions fleeing across borders. This is the chronicle of the most devastating economic collapse the Western Hemisphere has ever witnessed. And I need to warn you right now, what you're about to discover in the next 10 minutes will fundamentally alter how you understand wealth, power, and the fragility of democracy itself. Transport yourself back to 1970. You're waking up in Caracas. You swing open the windows of your apartment on the 25th floor of Centro Simon Bolivar, the most advanced residential complex in the Americas. These twin towers featured central air conditioning when most of the world was still using fans. The supermarkets on the ground floor were stocked with imported French cheeses and Italian wines. You head down in a smooth Otis elevator to your 1969 Chevrolet Impala in the parking garage. But there's something you cannot possibly know as you merge onto that immaculate highway, something lurking beneath the surface of all this prosperity, something that will systematically dismantle everything you see around you. You're now driving along the Autopista del Este, a 6-lane highway designed by American engineers for the car-centric lifestyle Venezuela had wholeheartedly adopted. The streets look like a mobile exhibition of Detroit's finest machinery. Fords, Chevrolets, Cadillacs. So where did all this extraordinary wealth come from? One word, oil. By 1970, Venezuela was the world's largest petroleum exporter, with the biggest proven reserves on the planet. And here's the critical statistic. 95% of Venezuelan exports were oil. 95%. Commit that number to memory, because embedded within that figure lies the genetic code of Venezuela's eventual destruction. Throughout the 1970s, the average Venezuelan enjoyed a higher standard of living than the average Spaniard or Italian. Their GDP per capita was over $4,000, while Spain's was under $2,500. Caracas residents flew to Miami for weekend shopping trips. The national motto was it's cheaper to import it than to make it here. And right there, in that single sentence, you can see the tragedy unfolding. While Venezuela used its oil money to buy everything from abroad, something vital was dying. Nobody was building large-scale farms, competitive factories, or independent government institutions. Why grow coffee when you could buy better Colombian beans with petrodollars? This logic was quietly building a vulnerability that would eventually detonate. Then, 1973, the oil crisis. The price per barrel quadruples overnight. Venezuela is drowning in cash. In 1976, the government nationalizes the entire oil industry, creating the state-owned company PDVSA. On paper, it sounds perfect. Venezuelan oil wealth for Venezuelan citizens. But a tiny crack in the foundation appears. With the oil industry under state control, the government now commands 90% of the entire national economy. Every dollar entering the country flows through government hands first. This created 3 fatal distortions. 1. The currency was artificially overvalued. 2. Virtually nobody paid taxes, because oil paid for everything. 3. The private sector became totally dependent on government contracts, killing real entrepreneurship. The 1980s and 90s were a slow, grinding agony. Inflation ran at 80% year after year. The gleaming skyscrapers began to decay. In 1989, military forces fired on civilians during protests. But the total annihilation of the old Venezuela began in 1999. Hugo Chavez assumes the presidency, promising to restore Venezuela's greatness with his 21st century socialism. But what he and his successor, Nicolas Maduro, actually built was far more sinister. They systematically dismantled every democratic institution. First, Chavez rewrote the constitution to concentrate power in the presidency. Then he stacked the Supreme Court with loyalists. The separation of powers was obliterated. He imported thousands of Cuban intelligence advisors, who taught his security forces the exact techniques Fidel Castro used to maintain totalitarian control. In 2003, Chavez implemented exchange controls, giving the government total power to decide who got dollars. It became a tool to reward loyalty and punish dissent. Then came the expropriations. Over 1,400 private businesses, cement plants, steel mills, farms were seized by the state. Production collapsed almost immediately, as political loyalists replaced competent managers. Industrial production plummeted by 75%. Venezuela, once nearly self-sufficient in food, could no longer feed its own people. But the economic destruction is only half the story. The other half is what they did to democracy. Political prisoners became routine. Armed paramilitary groups called colectivos terrorized neighborhoods. Independent media was systematically destroyed. By the time Venezuelans realized they had lost their democracy, the regime had captured every institution that could have stopped them. In 2013, Chavez died and Maduro took over. Maduro made the single worst decision in modern Latin American economic history. He began printing money on an incomprehensible scale. Why? Because the productive economy was destroyed, and the regime needed cash to pay its security forces and maintain control. Inflation exploded. 130% in 2015, 800% in 2016, and then 2018, 1,000,000% annual inflation. A teacher's monthly salary that could once buy an apartment could not buy a single kilogram of meat. Meanwhile, the ruling elite enriched themselves through massive corruption, with billions in oil revenue vanishing into offshore accounts. Let's return to the Centro Simon Bolivar Towers. Today, they are occupied by thousands of squatters. There is no running water. The elevators haven't worked in 15 years. Residents climb 30 flights of stairs carrying water in plastic jugs. 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled since 2015. That's a quarter of the entire population, the largest migration crisis in modern American history. So what destroyed Caracas? It was the deliberate dismantling of democracy combined with catastrophically incompetent socialist economic policies. This wasn't bad luck or foreign conspiracies. It was the predictable result of concentrating all power in the hands of leaders who valued political control over economic competence. Venezuela's oil dependence made it vulnerable, but what destroyed the economy was using that oil revenue as a political weapon. Institutions matter more than resources, and socialist regimes systematically destroy them. They eliminated every check on executive authority, creating the conditions for both tyranny and economic catastrophe. 21st century socialism was just 20th century socialism with better marketing, and it failed for the same reasons. Price controls created shortages. Expropriations destroyed production. And printing money to finance political control always ends in hyperinflation. In 1970, Venezuela was a flawed but functioning democracy, the wealthiest nation in Latin America. Today, it is an authoritarian regime and a humanitarian catastrophe. This isn't just Venezuela's story. It's a warning about what happens when societies sacrifice democratic institutions on the altar of revolutionary promises. Now I need you to do 3 things. First, write in the comments which country you believe could be on this same path. Second, share this video with someone who needs to understand how democracy dies. And third, subscribe, because next week we are analyzing how Chile avoided this fate and achieved prosperity. Remember this story, because the alternative is exile, imprisonment, or starvation.